The death of Sir Donald Bradman at the age of 92 in February 2001 saw an outpouring of genuine emotion throughout Australia and the cricket world.
I remember walking out of the funeral parlour in front of the hearse, and as we came round the corner and then the hearse came round behind us, all these people burst out into applause, and of course I just burst into tears. The emotional impact was so great.
Thank goodness he had a good long life, because he provided strength to Australia. And I think that's proven by the fact that when he died, a lot of people were feeling nothing short of despair. He's irreplaceable, and all we've got now is the books and the films.
Thousands lined the streets of Adelaide to farewell Sir Donald Bradman on his final journey. Many were not even born when Bradman last played cricket in 1949, but all had heard about the legend that was Bradman. It's remarkable, given the dramatic change in the ethnic makeup of Australia in the 50 years since Bradman retired from the game, that the Bradman legend seems to cross cultural boundaries and continues to grow even after his death.
And that's what Bradman made him particularly important, was that he represented the best of Australia. It didn't matter who you were, whether you're an immigrant coming in or whether you're an outsider looking in at Australia, you represented something unparalleled that Australia created.
This mystical figure that it was impossible to think that someone could average 100 playing cricket for Australia, and had every time we went out to bat, the whole country would stop and listen to see what he could do on the field. So the image of Don Bradman to me was almost untrue, and I couldn't believe that this person would be so good.
Other people have achieved many things in other fields, but in terms of popular culture, Bradman stands out. It's the Anzacs and Bradman from the first half of Australia's 20th century.
Australia's first true sporting hero was the immortal Victor Trumper, one of the great batsmen of cricket's golden age. Trumper's untimely death at the age of 37 from kidney disease in June 1915 was headline news in papers across Australia and in England. On the other side of the world, the young nation was facing its baptism of fire in the trenches of Gallipoli. The heroism of the Australian soldiers gave birth to the Anzac legend.
Australians weren't very large on the map until their contribution at Gallipoli and their fine efforts actually on the Western Front in 1918. And in this sense, actually, this was an opportunity to show Australia a light of sportsmen as well as warriors. And I find it very hard to believe that that wasn't in the minds of some of the public. That it's time we had another hero. I mean, it's been years. We don't have to fight another war to have another hero, do we? But we can always have a test match in which we're victors.
Australia needed new heroes, and they were to find one in the most unlikely of places. In the New South Wales country town of Bowral, there was a young boy who was destined to become Australia's first truly international and greatest sporting hero. His name was Donald George Bradman.
That relentless concentration, this inability to be distracted, a country town with plenty of open spaces and quietude is an ideal spot to nurture such intense concentration. Stories about him in the town are ones which don't speak of him playing with his friends in the backyard, a Huck Finn heaven. It's one of a boy who preferred to play alone, who practised.
His big hero was the great Australian batsman, New South Wales player Charlie McCartney. And I think there was a lovely story when at the ripe age of 12 he literally badgered his father for some days because England were playing in Sydney in the 2021 series against Australia, and he desperately wanted to go down and see Charlie and all the other players of the time play. And his father eventually gave in, and they spent 2 very happy days in Sydney at the Sydney Cricket Ground. And this was Don's first time in Sydney, and it must have been a wonderful occasion for him to see the heady heights and lights and all that Sydney had to offer, and to be at this ground that he'd only ever read about and seen photographs of. So it was a memorable day for him, and certainly Charlie McCartney didn't let him down. I think it was February of 1921, and he scored 170 on the day or so that Don was there, and so taken by all this that apparently Don remarked to his father George that he wouldn't be happy in life until he too had had an opportunity of playing out there in the middle of the Sydney Cricket Ground.
The young Bradman spent hours honing his hand-eye coordination by hitting a golf ball with a cricket stump against the tank stand at the back of the family home in Bowral.
Yeah, hitting a golf ball up against a tank stand with a cricket stump is near impossible. I think I've tried it a couple of times, and maybe at 2 in a row, that was the best. But seeing Sir Donald Bradman on that footage hit 3 or 4, that's pretty amazing. I would have liked to have seen whether he carried on and got 5 or 10, but I'm sure he would have had to miss it at some stage to prove that he was human.
The idea that he came from the country, from nowhere, the bush, the frontier, and came into the city, to Sydney, made his name and took on the world in a way that no one had ever sort of even thought of before, is what brings the Bradman story so much into people's imaginations and people's hearts.
I had an old friend, Struan Smith, who played for Mossman first grade, and he played in one Australian 11 match, I think, before the war. And he told me that he and Alan Fairfax, who played for Australia, bowled at him at the nets for 10 minutes when he first arrived from the country. And Fairfax turned around to Struan at the end, just at the end of it, he said, "Jesus, this bloke's crude." And Struan said, "But we haven't passed the bat yet."
It's often said that in order to be a great batsman, timing is everything. Exactly the same can be said about the birth of the Bradman legend. Don Bradman's rise to prominence coincided with major advances in communications. Newspaper circulation, both in Australia and overseas, was growing. The first talking picture was in 1927. Newsreels at local cinemas were coming into vogue. And of course, there was the enormous popularity of the radio.
Radio was a key. This was a golden age of Australian radio. Licences for radio receivers in Australia were going up at an extraordinary rate. And radio brought Bradman to an audience that arguably wouldn't have been exposed to him as directly if radio had not been there. Prior to that, it's print, it's newspapers. And if you're living out, as I say, in an isolated area, it takes time to arrive there. Radio, on the other hand, is instantaneous, and it creates a sense of community. It might be an imagined community, but the idea that we are listening to the same broadcast while you are in Melbourne and I am in Perth, that brings us together in a way that wasn't possible previously, and Bradman is sitting right there at this moment.
1930 was the year that Bradman's batting talent began to gain international prominence. In January of that year, 21-year-old Don Bradman scored a phenomenal 452 not out in the amazing time of just 415 minutes. It remains the highest individual score by a first-class cricketer in Australia.
Well, I was 10 years old when I saw a picture in the Times of India. I can still visualize the picture, Bradman executing an off drive, and the caption said, "Wonder batsman of Australia." That's when he had scored his 452, unbeaten 452 against Queensland. That's the first contact with Bradman. Ever since then I have been an admirer of his cricket.
The Australian team, captained by Mr. Woodfield, going out the field. This is the first match of their tour.
Bradman's remarkable batting feats on the 1930 tour of England would elevate him to unprecedented heights of hero status and celebrity. In the opening match of the tour at Worcester, in his first innings on English soil on the 1st of May, Bradman scored 236. By the end of May, Bradman had already scored a colossal tally of 1,000 runs.
And all he said about himself was, "I made 236, stiff and sore after running about." That's it.
In the Test matches, Bradman scored a record 974 runs at an average of 139.14, including a century, 2 double centuries and a triple century.
Don and my father played against each other at Trent Bridge in 1930 in the first test of that series. And my father and Don, a couple of years different in age, and hit it off almost immediately, and my father got Don out in the second innings for 131. We won the test, and my father was seen as something of a celebrity at that stage.
However, Bradman extracted his revenge on Walter Robbins and the other England bowlers in the second test at Lord's, when he scored a faultless 254.
The second test at Lord's, a very famous match, well documented, but it isn't quite often known that when Don went into bat in the first innings, father went up to Percy Chapman and said, "I'll bowl at him. I know how to bowl at him." And took the ball, and as he's going back to his mark and Don's walking in, Don says, "I'm going to hit the first one straight back over your head for 4. And father thought, "You wait." And rushed it, bowled the first ball. Don went straight up the track, hit him straight back over the head, and it hit the pickets in front of the pavilion, first ball. And from then on, he did not put a foot wrong. He made 254, and he always claimed that it was the best innings that he ever played.
He said that was an innings where the ball went exactly where he wanted it to every time he hit it. That's really saying something. I could never say that at any stage.
Cricket really meant a lot to people. And suddenly to have this phenomenon appearing, beating all the records. I mean, Hobson, Sutcliffe and Hammond, we had some great cricketers ourselves, but they all paled into insignificance compared with this amazing little man. And it created a very considerable impression.
England have never won a test on this ground yet, but it doesn't look like they're going to win this one the way Bradman is batting. Every time he scores something, hardly a ball gone in this over it he hasn't scored from. Bradman's 199 now. That's his 200. Well done.
In the third test at Headingley, Bradman scored 309 in a single day, on his way to a then record score of 334.
The entry for the day, he made that 309 in the day. And again, it's so like him. Beautiful day with just a nip in the air. We won the toss and batted. Archie out for 1, I followed, and at stumps was 309 not out. And then paraphrasing slightly, to the hotel in the evening for dinner, wrote letters, thence to bed. That's it.
Compartmentalisation is organisation. It's a way of organising your skills and energies in order to achieve something. I think Bradman was extraordinarily effective with it, to the point where even after he scored his triple century in England, the 334, he goes back to his room and listens to music and doesn't go down to the bar and shout his teammates and share the money that he was given for that performance, £1,000.
Whitelaw, the Australian magnate, sent him £1,000, which in our money is probably £100,000. And a lot of his teammates would have liked him to at least have taken him out for a beer, but he didn't do that.
One of the reasons that he tended to be criticised was that he was never one of the boys. He was never he didn't have that personality, wanting to go down and have a drink and have a good time. And it wasn't that he was standoffish.
Australia was a very blokey country, and Sir Donald wasn't a bloke. I mean, he might have been a chap, but he wasn't a bloke. He led a different life.
He couldn't stand all the fuss and all the attention. It was just a game. It was a hobby. He played, and that was it. He went back to the hotel and had his dinner and quiet chat with his friends, wrote a couple of letters and went to bed. That's how he was.
This is a man who knew what he needed to do to be successful. He's not average. Why should we present him as such?
How are you enjoying your trip to England?
Oh, having a great time, thanks.
That's the idea.
We're just having a wonderful time. The people are treating us so well that we're wondering we don't like going back home hardly enough. It's a wonderful time, but we find we're having a good deal of trouble with the weather. I don't think it's been a good summer. It's been dull, rainy most of the time. In fact, we've only had about one decent month all the time we've been here, and that was about the second month after we arrived. Then, of course, with the dull weather, it makes cricket much harder. We're used to a very bright light, middle of summer, the hot weather, and when you get on these dull conditions, it makes it very awkward for you to see the ball.
One of the many amazing things about Sir Donald is the degree to which he didn't feel the need to fit in. I mean, even as a young chap, he wasn't there at the bar trying to fit in with the older members of the team. He always let his cricket speak for itself. He must have been a very confident chap in that way.
Certainly he wasn't afraid on particularly the 30 Ashes tour to, lecture senior players on the merits of not drinking and smoking and so on. And a young man telling these distinguished members of the side, that's going to cause resentment.
He wasn't lovable. He was someone who was admired, envied. Envy plays a very big role in what some people said about him subsequently.
And I try and get as many runs as I possibly can, and if in getting those runs I should happen to break any record, well, naturally, I'm very pleased, but I do not deliberately set out to try and break records.
Don Bradman finished the 1930 tour with a record total of 2,960 runs at an average of 98.66. Cricket lovers in England had never seen the like of him before, and Bradman soon became idolised by thousands of young boys throughout the country.
I was 9, and we lived in Kent, and my father was 1930. My father took me to Canterbury to see the Australians play Kent. Bradman came in and scored 17, and Kent brought on Titch Freeman, the slow bowler who was very effective in county cricket. He took 300 wickets every season, which is large. Never been done since. But the England selectors, for some reason, thought that he would be murdered at Test level, and they didn't pick him all that season. Anyway, he comes on to bowl, and he bowls 2 leg breaks on the off stump, which spin away, and Bradman leaves them. And he bowls his top spinner, and Bradman leaves it, and he's plumb. LBW. To the consternation of everybody. As a small boy, I was glad that my Titch Freeman got the great Bradman out, but, we'd all come to see Bradman. It was really was a disaster. My father threw his hands in the air, wish we hadn't come, Anyway, as Bradman started to go back to the pavilion, we small boys flooded onto the ground, hoping to get his autograph. And we surrounded him, and to our consternation, he took his baton in his hand and waved it ferociously at us and waved us out of the way. It was quite dangerous, really. So we scattered without our autograph, and he went into the pavilion. 56 years later, in 1986 at Adelaide, the Queen was visiting Adelaide in Britannia and gave a lunch party to which Bradman was, of course, invited. As a result of a certain amount of cadging on my part, Bradman, of course, sat on one side of her, and I was allowed to sit on the other side of Bradman. Rather boldly, I told him the story of Canterbury. And it was very interesting. He was quite charming about it, but he said, yes, I remember clearly. I was very angry. I really was. He diddled me with that top spinner, and I was furious. And then he was so kind, and he said, I'm awfully sorry. I must make amends for that. And he took the menu card, the lunch menu card, Britannia one, which is rather nice, coloured one with a picture of the Royal Yacht on it. And he grabbed it and signed it for me and gave it to me. So it was a very happy ending for me, yes.
Sir Donald Bradman, what a welcome waits for you back home.
Don Bradman returned from the 1930 tour of England a national hero. Much to the chagrin of many of the other players, Bradman was picked up in Perth and flown ahead of the rest of the team and feted at a series of public and civic receptions.
Bradman's sort of role or emergence after the 1930 tour was one that I think in many ways introduced the idea of almost celebrity to Australia. He was feted in a way that we'd never seen before. He was given a Chevrolet car, he was given receptions throughout the Australian cities. And what interests me most there is the fact that he was put so far above the shoulders of his teammates and caused a lot of resentment. Part of the reason for the adulation is certainly due to the tough economic times, the depression, and he announced Australia as successful on an international stage and in empire. He dominated England in a way that had never been achieved before. So he almost offered symbolic regeneration in very dark times.
The depression was a very traumatic experience for a lot of people. You have about 25% to 1/3 of people unemployed. You have soup kitchens. You have a lot of bad news in the early 30s, and so it was a particular decade where society almost wanted good news stories, and Bradman was the biggest good news story to come out of Australia in the 30s.
Everybody needs a hero, but you really do need a hero if you're hitting bad times. And it's Australia hitting bad times. Australia badly needed that sort of hero. And they got it.
I met him at Dungog. My father was a school teacher. He'd come up there as representing Mick Simmons, who was sports store retailers. And there I was, I think I was 9 years of age, and I shook the great man's hand, because he was, at that stage, it would be about 1930, 31. I mean, probably just after he came back from England in 1930, and of course he was becoming every child's hero anyway.
Almost overnight, he became both a hero, a moral paragon or a moral exemplar, but also a celebrity, all rolled into one. And as well, I think he became the brand of Australian cricket, that Australian cricket was authentic, it was original and highly successful.
What do you do when you are better than everybody else? And unfortunately, you know it, and they know it. There's no I in team. Well, with Bradman there was.
In those days, I would open with Jack Fingleton for New South Wales, and Jack was a tremendous player, he never took a backward step. If we had a good day and we batted till, say, lunchtime on the first day, the word would get around Sydney, Bradman will be batting this afternoon. And the crowd would grow from, say, 10,000 to 20 and even 30,000, even 40,000. And they'd all be coming to watch Bradman. And after lunch, they'd give you about 20 minutes batting time, then they'd get restless because it was very obvious that they didn't come out there to watch you play, you see. Well, but if you were hit on the pads, not only would the bowler and the fieldsman appeal, but the whole 30,000 would appeal. And when you did eventually get out, you'd get a tremendous ovation, not because you played well, because you're getting out of the way and letting the great man in, and that is what they came for.
Anyone who hasn't seen Sir Donald play live would say that that would be the one sporting moment that if they had a wish to come true, that would certainly be it. And I'd love to be out there amongst the crowd, a packed crowd at the SCG or wherever, and just feeling what the atmosphere was like. I'm sure to be tense but excitable at the same time, and then just to see him play and to destroy an attack would be a pretty good day's watching sport.
I think one thing which really struck me the most was his aggressive batting. The ability to play shots, and you could make out while playing shots he really meant it. I mean, he wanted to demoralize the opposition, and being the old films, I mean, you can make out even in those films you can make out the body language, and with very few cameras, and that was something amazing. It really struck me, and I said, oh, this is something.
Bradman always seemed to be unattainable. He belonged on a different planet. He was beamed down now and again to play. I mean, it's difficult to imagine the kind of feeling that a child had about Bradman in those days. I mean, he was a superstar. It's a bit like sort of the Beckham thing today, I suppose, in football, but the nearest you could ever get to it, or Tiger was in golf. But in many ways, he meant more than that. He was significantly alone in his kind of stuff. So he was unreachable, unattainable.
Now I ask you, is he any good? Our Don Bradman, as the batsman, he is certainly plump wood.
He really was at the vanguard of commercial promotion, the first evolution of the type of promotion we expect to see these days from our elite sports people. Bats, pads, gloves, automotive products, lolly sticks, ice creams, you name it. His name would be put to it if the terms were right and he was available and willing. This makes him an exceptional figure in the 30s. In the past 20 or 30 years, this idea that Bradman never cashed in, that he was beyond the need for the dollar or even chasing it, is an interesting one, because you can split Bradman's career or life into two sections. His playing career, where he was very much into making the most of his cricketing opportunities through additional commercial opportunities, and his post-career, where he withdrew and wasn't interested in the celebrity circuit and wasn't interested in promoting things then.
The offer I received to go to England was a very good one. At the same time, I felt that I would like to remain in Australia if it was possible for me to do so. 3 prominent Australian business concerns made me a combined offer of a contract to remain here, which I accepted in preference to going home to the old country.
If you wind it back to the young Don, who didn't know where his next pound was coming from, he was very close to becoming a professional in England. That contract dangled by Accrington, Lancashire, in front of him. He apparently was ready to sign that, and Australian cricket would have lost it.
And he used this as leverage to get quite a favourable 3-way commercial deal for his services.
He got that triple deal from 2UE and the Sun newspaper in Sydney and F.J. Palmer's, and that kept him home, and thank goodness for that.
What is most interesting is the way he spoke about the fact that he saw himself as selling his services on an open market. He used the metaphor of a singer selling his services to an entrepreneur. That, in fact, he knew his worth. He knew it was worth a lot financially in terms of gate money and sort of even the image of Australian cricket at the time and what made the money flow.
So total was Don Bradman's dominance over the game of cricket, it was inevitable that opponents would begin to devise methods to try and curb his prolific scoring. The tactics used by England captain Douglas Jardine during the infamous 1932-33 Bodyline series succeeded to the extent that Bradman's phenomenal batting average was reduced to a still very respectable 56.57.
He was assured when he played cricket. He said and wrote several times that he didn't feel nervous. Though I think things changed a bit after the Bodyline series.
I think Bodyline scarred not only him but the other players at the time, because it was... There's no way you could really handle it. You played defensively and you had the infield. You played a hook shot, you had the outfield. Everybody was on the leg side. It was either get hit or duck. And remember, there were no helmets around in those days, so it was a bit scary, I would say.
The man with the greatest hook shot I have ever seen would be Stanley Joseph McCabe. And he was the only fellow I ever saw to completely get on top of the body line, not all the time, but for 1 or 2 fairly brief periods when he gave them quite a thrashing with his glorious hook shot. Otherwise, most of the players seemed to be fairly unhappy about it and didn't enjoy it.
The 1932-33 Bodyline series, I think, certainly scarred Bradman. His teammates talk about the fact that he never came quite right for at least 18 months afterwards. O'Reilly was one of the people who sort of pointed this out after the Bodyline mini-series in 1984 was presented, and Bradman standing there heroically, sort of taking on the Poms, and he said the reality wasn't quite that. He was genuinely shaken by it.
It was done to thwart him, and he was understandably always at great pains to say that he wasn't intimidated by it, that he chose his own way to deal with it, but he wasn't intimidated by it.
Although many of the Australian batsmen were struck and suffered injuries, most notably Captain Bill Woodfull and wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield, Bradman's superior footwork and agility saw him escape injury. However, his ploy of often stepping back to the leg side to enable more scoring opportunities opened him up to accusations of not standing up to Bodyline.
This is something that obviously played on Bradman's mind a lot because in his autobiography, 16 or 17 years after the series, after he had achieved so much, led home the undefeated 48 Invincibles, he continues to defend himself against these accusations, and you see it there in Farewell to Cricket. And I find that fascinating, that someone who had achieved so much would even feel the need to justify themselves. He still averaged the most of any player in the series, but it says a lot about how, as I say, Australian masculinity is forged on sporting fields, and war for that matter, that idea of never backing down, of not avoiding injury if it's for the better of the team.
He saw Jardine once after 1932, and they sat together in the press box. And I said, "What did you talk about?" He said, "Nothing." "Did you talk?" No, there was nothing to talk about. So they sat together. It wasn't that they weren't talking, it was just that they had nothing to say to each other.
Don was writing, I think, for the Mail in Australia, and Jardine was with the Herald. And Bedser gets his wicket knocked over, and Douglas Jardine says, "Well, that's the best Yorker I've seen all year. Wonderful ball." And Don said, "What are you talking about, Douglas? It hit the wicket halfway up. How could it possibly be a Yorker?" He said, "Well, it'll be a Yorker in the Herald." That's the last time that they saw or spoke to each other.
There were so many questions about the Bodyline tour one wanted to ask him about. There were so many questions about being a superstar at a time when they weren't invented, about having this commercial empire built around him in the 30s. I mean, he released a record, for God's sake, playing piano and singing. He had a ticker tape welcome through the streets. I mean, this is in the 30s. I mean, now we take that for granted. Even so, a ticker tape welcome would be remarkable, even by today's commercial standards. So he was this extraordinary person, not just a cricketer, but this huge star.
Employing measures to curb someone's total dominance of a particular sport was not just reserved for Don Bradman. There was another Australian sporting hero in the 1930s whose total dominance of his sport prompted a change in the rules.
Walter Lindrum was a magnificent billiard player. He was world champion. And what they did, he used to score with kiss cannons, go all round the table. Now, they decided, partway through his career, that after he'd scored 100, I think it was the cue ball that had to go up and down the table, or whatever it is, before he could start again and continue this kiss cannon business round the table. The other one, of course, was Bradman. Bodyline. And Bodyline would never have got Bradman out if people had come along to see a gymnastics display. But of course, the point of the exercise was you had to make runs. And he tried to fabricate shots in order to put runs on the board. Now, these are the only two occasions that I can remember where laws have ever been changed, or rules, or actions been taken to curb the dominance of great performers.
A measure of his determination and his perfectionism is that he played billiards against the world's best, Walter Lindrum, who wiped the table before Don could even play a stroke. So he practiced and he practiced and he practiced, and when he had a return game against Lindrum, he said, well, it's only fair that I break. And he broke, and he sank every ball for 147, and I just can't imagine a look on Lindrum's face. It's terrifying that a man can be that good by choice when he sets his heart to it.
He was good at anything he really took up, like he was a good classic pianist, he was a good billiard player, he was a good golfer, and he didn't pretend he was good. You didn't know he was good, he didn't tell you. He was that type of bloke.
Mrs. Bradman, followed by Don, leaves her hotel en route to catch the boat train at Victoria on their way back to Australia. It will be remembered that Mrs. Bradman rushed to England when her husband's health gave cause for anxiety after his operation for appendicitis. Now he is fit and cheery once more, but inclined to be reticent when questioned as to how soon he expects to be playing cricket again.
In 1934, on the tour of England, he wasn't quite himself. He was still making runs fairly plentifully, and when he made 304 in the Leeds test, everyone said, well, he's okay. But after the Oval test, where he made only 244, things went wrong, and he suddenly collapsed with peritonitis, and he was at one moment given up for dead.
In those days, you normally didn't recover from peritonitis. So everybody assumed that he was going to die. And when a great cricketer, or great anybody, great personality, if you like, is going to die, I mean, let's take David Beckham as an example. If Beckham were to keel over tomorrow with peritonitis and we look at him dying, it'd be the same thing. It'd be front page news everywhere, and in those days, of course, it was the same with Bradman. And the King wanted to know all about it, and people gave blood, and people stood outside the hospital.
Message was got to his wife in faraway Adelaide, or Sydney then, and you couldn't get to England in a hurry. The offer was to fly her part of the way and then go by ship. She must have been a very, very worried woman. She sent out a brave message, though, I'm coming, Don, and that must have cheered him up during his periods of consciousness. But he was nearly lost. Sir Douglas Shields, the Australian surgeon, helped to save his life, and Jessie got to England to find him looking quite well, but it was a very near thing, and they convalesced. King George had shown concern, perhaps not just because he admired him as a cricketer, he'd shaken his hand at Lord's, but he reasoned that Don Bradman was a pretty important ingredient in the empire picture. England was proud of him too, in a weird sort of way.
Don and Jessie Bradman's love match was both a long and enduring partnership.
It was the most extraordinary and happy marriage. Jessie was the only person who could contradict him, who could say, come on, Don, you don't mean that, do you, Don? And he would accept that. He wouldn't accept it from anybody else. But I think that partnership was really quite extraordinary. You don't see marriages like that often.
When he found Jessie, when they were kids, I suppose that was the most important ingredient in his long life, because she was there almost all the way, and she must have been the most tremendous support and comfort to him.
She had a capacity for joy like nobody I ever knew. She was very, very even, but just extraordinarily joyful. And she had lots of sayings. Her favourite saying was, it's never so bad as not good for something. She could always find something positive, something good, and she would home in on that.
He has what I think is a really quite a touching and fond, open love for her, and makes dedications to her in public. The normal sort of team sport, the missus is left at home. The affection is for the private sphere, not the public, and he prefers the company of his wife over that of his teammates. Now, when it comes to the Australian legend and romantic ideals of what Australian mates and men are like, there is a contradiction there.
Don Bradman was appointed captain of Australia for the 1936-37 Ashes series against Gubby Allen's MCC team. Things did not go the way Bradman would have liked, as Australia lost the first 2 tests of the 5-test series, largely because Australia was caught on rain-affected pitches. Don Bradman was dismissed for a duck in both of those matches.
2-0 down, Bradman failed. What's going on? Suddenly, a handful of the Roman Catholic cricketers in the Australian 11 are called up to meet the Australian Board of Control. Don Bradman always denied that he had any knowledge of this, but they suspected that he'd dobbed them in. So Bill O'Reilly and Fingleton and Fleetwood Smith and O'Brien, they're standing there in front of this very stern figure, Dr. Alan Robertson, the chairman of the Australian Board, and not a word was spoken. There was a bit of uncomfortable shifting, and good old Bill O'Reilly spoke up. Had to be Bill. He said, well, what's going on? What are we here for? You know, what's the problem? And it was agreed that there wasn't any great problem. There was a suspicion that they might have been pulling their weight, and Australia were 2-0 down, which was outrageous, really.
The fact that the players hauled up before the board were all hard-drinking Irish Catholics, and Bradman was a Protestant, Mason and a teetotaler, raised some eyebrows at the time. It must be remembered that the religious divide in Australian society was far more pronounced in the 1930s than it is today.
Sectarian divisions in the Australian community during the 30s were a common feature. Bradman and Fingleton and O'Reilly are no exception to this.
And we'll never crack that one, I think, why those boys were hauled up. But one of the upshots was that 2 in particular, Jack Fingleton, Bill O'Reilly, any feeling they had for Don Bradman was dissipated. And they became even more suspicious of him, and that divide opened up on religious grounds, but I think it was more on personality grounds.
There would have been an inevitable jealousy around Bradman. He stood taller than the team, which makes other people's contributions to the effort pale by comparison. Professional cricketers, elite-level sports people, this must be very hard to take. They're very talented individuals.
Bill O'Reilly was Bill O'Reilly, and he was not an easy man to sort of handle. You know, he had his own ideas about things. He respected Bradman tremendously, and in the main they cooperated very well. Bill bowled his heart out for Bradman the same as he did for anybody else.
Jack Fingleton was a very, very sensitive man, much more prickly than Bill O'Reilly ever was, and he would say, oh, you didn't bat with Don Bradman, you ran for him. And he wrote some of the most adulatory stuff on Don Bradman, but he also gave the other side, what he perceived as less attractive characteristics of Don Bradman.
Not everyone agreed with him, but I can't recollect any of that affecting in any way the performance of the players or their attitude towards Bradman on the field.
During the vital 3rd test in Melbourne, with the match and the series in the balance, Jack Fingleton and Don Bradman combined in a record 6th wicket partnership of 346 to turn the match in Australia's favour. Fingleton scored 136, Bradman 270.
This is when he reversed the batting order and opened with O'Reilly and Fleetwood Smith because of the sticky wicket.
I saw him in the 2nd innings when he came in number 7 for Australia and finished up with 270. And of course, he became the hero. I can understand the kids of today having their heroes, but Bradman was my hero.
The Australians made a huge score in the 2nd innings, and I clearly remember Bradman then not only batting, but he's running between the wickets. He was so quick and so fast.
After Bradman's heroics, spinners O'Reilly and Fleetwood Smith bowled Australia to victory. In the next test in Adelaide, Bradman made another double century, and once again, O'Reilly and Fleetwood Smith spun Australia to victory. The series was now square at 2-all, going into the final test in Melbourne.
Melbourne, and the 5th test opens with Bradman and Allen tossing, and Bradman wins for the 3rd consecutive time. Don's happy smile was reflected on every Australian's face.
An example of Bradman's single-minded determination to succeed against the odds occurred when he and Stan McCabe were involved in a match-winning stand on a boiling hot day at the MCG. Both players ended up making centuries, but the stifling heat took its toll on McCabe.
Bradman was not the fittest and strongest man who ever played cricket, but he gave the impression of being so, and certainly the mental toughness was applied to any physical handicap, so that when someone else showed signs of wilting, as did Stan McCabe on one occasion, he was quite impatient, and McCabe eventually got out, but having said to Don, I don't feel too good out here, it was very hot and they'd been batting for a long time. When Don eventually got out or came in unbeaten at the end of the day, he wasn't terribly sympathetic towards Stan McCabe, although he himself needed to be sort of cool towel down. He wasn't going to give in to physical frailty. He was mentally and physically extremely tough.
What made him concentrate so much, what made him so determined to practice and so determined not to get out when he got past 20 or 30, not to get out when he got past 100, not to get out when he got past 200. He was driven because he was driven. Now that in itself creates difficulties for other people, because if somebody is as driven as that, people around him tend to say, hey, look, hang about a bit, life is not all seriousness.
Bradman was an extremely driven man, extremely determined, and there are some parts of his determination that are very attractive. He's the ultimate achiever, but there are other parts that are perhaps less attractive, and this is where it's difficult to assess the man.
I think most men as talented and as separated by their talent, as Bradman was from the herd, if you like, are incredibly self-sufficient and can only see any problem through their own eyes with very narrow tunnel vision. That made him a ruthless captain, but not a very popular one. And I think that drive dominated his entire life, that he was D.G. Bradman, and the world around him was around him, but it was he who was the centre of the universe in that sense. I don't think that makes him remarkable. I think I've observed in a lot of people who are very, very good at their jobs, that's what they do. They are singular people.
There were many other great players in the Bradman era that were forced to live in the shadow of the Don. One such player was Stan McCabe. In any other era, McCabe would probably have been regarded as the preeminent batsman of his time. Don Bradman was fulsome in his praise of McCabe's heroic 232 at Nottingham in 1938, an innings that saved Australia from certain defeat. Bradman called all his players onto the balcony to watch McCabe's epic display. He said they were unlikely to witness the like of it again.
Well, all I can say is that everybody, including Don, was absolutely thrilled at the way McCabe played and the shots that he played. And it didn't matter how they bowled or, to a certain extent, where they bowled. He just seemed so easily hit the ball through Wally Hammond's field, and at times Wally Hammond had 4 and 5 fellas on the fence trying to stop the spate of runs from McCabe's bat. At one stage there, the last wicket between Fleetwood Smith and McCabe, they put on, I think, 85 runs in 25 minutes, of which Fleetwood Smith scored 5. And McCabe was just batting so well that when he came in, Don went up to him and said, I was standing right there, he said, Stan, he said, I would be the proudest man in the world to be able to bat like that. That was coming from the great man himself.
The 1938 tour of England was Bradman's first tour as Australian captain, and was a tough tour for the skipper both on and off the field. It's been said that if World War II had not intervened, Bradman would not have toured England in 1942. Australia struggled to draw the series 1-1 and retain the Ashes. However, the 1938 tour was not without some wonderful personal achievements by Bradman.
The directors of the Royal Worcester Porcelain Company were so taken by Sir Donald's feat in making 3 double centuries in successive tours of England in 1930, 1934 and 1938. In the first match of the tour at Worcester Ground, that they commissioned this magnificent piece of royal porcelain pottery and had a scene of Sir Donald batting, taken from a photograph, hand-painted on this beautiful vase. And it had great sentimental value to Sir Donald.
Sentimental was not the way Don Bradman looked upon opponents on the cricket field. Many have said that his ruthless approach towards beating England stems from both his memories of bodyline and the 5th Test at the Oval in 1938. Bradman was the first to congratulate 22-year-old Len Hutton when he passed the Don's Test record score on his way to an eventual 364. However, England batted on and on to score 7 for 903 declared. This was despite the fact that both Jack Fingleton and Don Bradman were injured and unable to bat. Bradman broke a bone in his foot while bowling and took no further part in the match or the rest of the tour. England won the match by the record margin of an innings and 579 runs.
He was badly injured, broke his ankle in the last Test match, and disappeared from view, from public view, for 6 weeks. And the press couldn't find him, but what happened was that he came and stayed with the family in Burnham Beeches, and Don was forever grateful for the way that my mother particularly looked after him while he was recuperating.
At the end of the 1938 tour, Don Bradman was 30 years old. It would be 8 years before he would play another Test match. As the Australian Test team made their way home by ship, they could not fail to notice the storm clouds that were brewing on the horizon. Very soon, events in Europe would change their lives and the lives of millions of others forever.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of the persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
The Second World War brought mixed blessings for Don Bradman. He volunteered for military service in 1940, but was invalided out of the army the following year because of a back-related condition known as fibrositis. However, it was the financial collapse and subsequent jailing in 1945 of his employer of 10 years, high-profile stockbroker Harry Hodgetts, that would cast a shadow over Bradman's post-war business career.
There is no way knowing that Don Bradman is number 2 in the Harry Hodgetts business, and as the only other person apart from Hodgetts authorised to sign cheques, could not possibly have known that the business was trading insolvent from 1939. He must have known. It's inconceivable that he did not.
The shadow was there, and it stayed about the place for quite a long while. But essentially, too, remember, it was Bradman the cricketer, not Bradman the broker, that was in the public mind. And his post-war successes, I think, helped to cloud the picture of any involvement of Bradman in this collapse.
Gentlemen, pray silence for Mr. G. Bradman.
My Lord Chairman, Your Excellencies, my Lords, Mr. Lusengore, and gentlemen, if I had my own way at this moment, I would appeal very vigorously against the light. But as the umpires have decreed that I should play on, and endeavouring to be a sportsman, I shall do so. Cricket is a very peculiar game, as we all know, and it is played throughout the British Empire but somehow or other it is not favoured in other countries. I don't know why it is that cricket is the one game so true to the taste and the character of English peoples.
At the tender age of 21, Don Bradman had become Australia's national hero. His phenomenal achievements on the cricket field had in fact made him a hero of the empire. Bradman had countered the attempts to tame his batting genius and continued to score runs. But he realised that cricket would not last forever. The time was right to start planning for life after cricket.
He was very keen to set himself up for life and his family, and it seems like a responsible thing to do to me. But he's not allowed this luxury. For some reason he's meant to be beyond the need for money.
In 1934, Don Bradman accepted an offer from prominent Adelaide stockbroker Harry Hodgetts to move to South Australia to play cricket and work in his stockbroking firm. In 1945, Harry Hodgetts, a pillar of the Adelaide establishment, was convicted of fraud and false pretences and sentenced to a jail term of 5 years.
Did he know about Hodgetts? He must have done. I mean, there were only 4 or 5 people in the firm. There were transactions going through the whole time. He must have done. Why didn't he blow the whistle? Didn't want to lose his job? Nowhere else to go? How had it come that he had the lease on the office in his name? How come that he managed to hoover up all Hodgetts' clients? A lot of interesting stuff there, and I can understand why how can I put it, this somewhat restrained establishment in Adelaide, if I put it gently, get slightly upset about this.
Henry Warburton Hodgetts was a wealthy and successful stockbroker of 25 years standing, with a gilt-edged list of clients that included such luminaries as Lord Gowrie, former Governor of South Australia and later Governor-General of Australia. Hodgetts was also a member of the board of the South Australian Cricket Association and the Australian Board of Control. It was through these affiliations that he was able to persuade Don Bradman to move to South Australia to play cricket, in exchange for the chance to pursue a career in stockbroking with his firm.
There was obviously a lot of commercial interest in the arrangement for Hodgetts. I mean to say he had the greatest sportsman in the British Empire working for him and dealing with clients. It would have certainly helped to write business.
Harry Hodgetts had gambled unsuccessfully on wheat futures in the late 1930s, invested heavily in some mining ventures that didn't come off, and hotel construction in Darwin that was thwarted by the outbreak of the Second World War. Severe exchange controls and restrictions under the National Security Act by the federal government during the war years made it increasingly difficult for any stockbroker to trade himself out of any financial dilemma.
Well, it was on a Saturday morning, June the 2nd, 1945. Hodgetts announced to the exchange that he was unable to meet his commitments. That was the normal method by which a broker disclosed that his business was in difficulty and he couldn't meet his obligations to other brokers.
The bankruptcy files clearly demonstrate that Bradman had a substantial knowledge of the trouble that Hodgetts was in for at least 3 or 4 days before the announcement.
Well, Bradman was second in charge of the firm. He always stressed that he was an employee. He was not a partner in the business, and there was no evidence that he was deeply involved in any decisions that were made within the firm regarding its capital or what happened to it. Hodgetts, like many brokers, was essentially an individual trader.
And the receiver and his people should have gone in and examined the books to ascertain exactly what the situation was and how the company might be able to trade out of its troubles, which is the first responsibility of the receiver in these circumstances, to protect the interests of the creditors.
Hodgetts was pledging scrip that belonged to other people as security for loans in his desperate efforts to get money into the firm. Now, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that Bradman was party to that.
The Adelaide establishment, for want of a better expression, and certainly the Adelaide Stock Exchange decided that the best way to deal with this scandal and to restore the reputation of commerce in Adelaide was to have a seamless as possible transition from Hodgetts to Bradman, and that Bradman's name would help the exchange ride out this scandal.
At the moment Hodgetts went out of business, Bradman was unemployed. He had to do something for his future. He'd already bought a seat on the exchange. He simply made application to the Stock Exchange Committee to begin trading on his own account. They gave him the okay to do that, and so away he went. There's no suggestion, I think, that he did anything underhand in that.
36 hours from the time that Harry Hodgetts told the Adelaide Stock Exchange that he could not meet his commitments, 36 hours later there's a sign writer at the Grenfell Street office painting Bradman's name in huge gold letters on the front window. That's amazing, absolutely amazing that the receiver could allow that to happen.
I've got no doubt that when Hodgetts, the firm, went down, that Bradman's ability as a cricketer and a salesman allowed him to get to Hodgetts' clients. No doubt about that.
He certainly got given advantages which he had no right to be given, and he acquired things, specifically the lease on the on Harry Hodgetts' stockbroking premises and his 4,000 strong client list. He got them for nothing. They should have been put out to tender.
He was mindful, I think, of what a number of people had been saying, that he should have paid goodwill into the estate of Hodgetts to allow him to take over what essentially was Hodgetts' business, and that was something that had annoyed many in the broking fraternity. When he passed the business on to Len Bullock, he did so freely, and to that extent perhaps it may have been some admission of the fact that he was making amends for something that had happened earlier.
I went to see the official receiver, and I said, I'd like to look at all the Hodgetts papers, please, because the firm went into receivership, and I'd like to know who did what and where and what the court said. And he shuffled around a lot, and afterwards he said, well, I can produce some papers. I said, I don't want some papers, I want all the papers. I'll tell you which ones I want photocopied. After all, they're public documents, aren't they? And he looked at me and he said, does Sir Donald know you're doing this? Have you cleared it with Sir Donald? I said, no, I haven't cleared it with Sir Donald, and I'm not going to tell Sir Donald that I'm doing this. It's absurdity. So even then, the name of Bradman, Hodgetts, all that stuff was treated kid gloves by the officials.
At the end of the Second World War, Don Bradman felt he had a duty to help get international cricket going again. After 6 years out of the game, he made a comeback to big-time cricket at the age of 38. Bradman captained Australia in a home test series against England in 1946-47 and was soon scoring runs. In the second test in Sydney, Bradman and opener Sid Barnes both scored 234 in a record partnership of 385. One of the bowlers that had to bowl to Bradman was Alec Bedser, who was making his first tour of Australia.
I'd been 6 years in the war. I mean, it didn't matter much what happened after that. All I thought was bloody lucky to be out there playing cricket and having a wonderful time for 8 months. They said to me it must have been a long trip. I said I didn't want it to end. I could have gone on forever as far as I was concerned.
Another young player to make his debut in that series was left-handed opening batsman Arthur Morris.
I was a little bit different in style to most batsmen, I think, because I do remember him saying to me one day, he said, I don't know how you do it, but keep on doing it. And so that's as far as that went, but I was doing all right. So.
When Alec Bedser clean-bowled Bradman for a duck in the 4th Test in Adelaide, Bradman described it as the finest delivery he ever faced in first-class cricket.
And when Don came in, he always tried to push the ball short to mid-wicket. So we put 2 fielders on the forward push to stop that. And then if the ball swung late, you'd, in point of fact, have a slip catch on the leg side because you'd get the inside of the bat. And of course the ball did swing late, and Don played at it, and it pitched on about leg stump, middle of the leg, and it gripped and it hit the off stump. And he must have missed it by 4 inches.
It was a very good ball. He went to play it on the onside and it took the off bail, so that's how much it cut back on the wicket, which really was a superb ball.
During the following summer, 1947-48, Australia played host to India in the first official Test series between the two countries. Although Don Bradman never played cricket on the subcontinent, his popularity amongst cricket lovers in India is unsurpassed and undiminished.
Indians worship multitude of gods, but when it comes to cricket, Bradman is the god of cricket. I was present at an argument between 2 schoolboys as to who was greater, Mahatma Gandhi or Don Bradman. I mean, it was an absurd sort of comparison, but I was present at the, and probably schoolboys worship sportsmen more than they worship saints and politicians.
One particular scorer of the CCI went in sometime in late 70s to Australia with the CCI team. And he took it on to himself that he had to have a darshan, which is he had to meet Don Bradman and take his autograph. And he went for 3 days and knocked the door, rang the bell, no response. One day the luck was on his side, and he said the hour of reckoning had arrived. I don't know what he found, but he jumped over the hedge. And if he had done that, it would have been an Indian high jump record, but he landed in front of Don Bradman. And he told me that Bradman put his hands up and said, I surrender, because he thought he wanted to take his life. So he folded his hands and said, "Sir, all that I want is your autograph." This was a complete turnaround of events. So Don put his hand on his shoulders, took him inside the house, made a cup of tea, signed his autograph, and this is a legend in the folklore of Cricket Club of India.
The first time that I had some contact with the great man was when I actually played with him. The occurrence of that was when he made his 100th century in Sydney, and that happened to be my first representative game. It was an Australian 11 versus India, and I was privileged to play and watch him make his 100th century.
Don Bradman is the only Australian cricketer who has scored 100 first-class centuries. Indians take particular pride in the fact that the god of cricket scored his 100th 100 against India.
Amarnath put Kishan Chand to bowl when he was nearing his 100th century. Now Kishan Chand was no bowler at all. So probably Amarnath wanted him to get his 100th century against India. That as he delivered the ball, Kishan Chand delivered the ball. He said he was almost preparing to clap as he delivered the ball.
Now, it took Bradman 295 innings to score his 100th century. Do you know who's second? You're going to be surprised. He wasn't a bad player. Dennis Compton. 552 innings. Viv Richards. Good heavens, what sort of a player was he? He was a great player. Took him 658 innings to score his 100th century. Now that's got to say something. I mean, the man was a genius.
India also takes great pride from the fact that Sir Donald Bradman personally anointed Indian batting maestro Sachin Tendulkar as the modern-day batsman whose style most resembled his own.
Bradman goes into the bedroom and tells Jessie, "I never saw myself play. I think the way this young boy plays, it almost reminds me I used to play like that. And Jessie came out and watched it on the television, and she said yes.
Well, I mean, this is the greatest compliment one can ever get, and it's a sheer coincidence because I only got to see the cassettes when I was 16 or 17. Until then, I was just so engrossed in my own game. I was just trying to score as many runs as possible so I could play for India. And there, after a few years, you get to know that Sir Don's style resembles, my style rather resembles Sir Don's. I mean, that's something amazing, and I was absolutely thrilled about it.
He plays like Bradman. He gets down the wicket like Bradman used to do to slow bowling. His feet are so good. His feet movements are good. He's got this ability, like Bradman, to pick up the ball probably quicker, of the line and the length of the ball, probably quicker than anybody else playing the game today. And that's what makes great players so great. And yeah, he'd be probably the closest, I think, to Bradman that I've seen.
He carries the weight of a nation much the same way Sir Donald did for Australia. So he's probably the closest thing to Bradman from a modern day player's perspective, and some of his shots are very similar to the way Sir Donald played. So it's probably a fair analysis that he is the closest of the modern day players to what he was like.
When it comes to India, you're talking of 1 billion people, and Tendulkar has a sway over 1 billion people. So the following of Tendulkar by sheer numbers is, I think, 300 or 300% more than Sir Don because of the population of Australia. Otherwise, if Don was born here, I think they would have made a temple for him.
Wherever he went, it was very difficult for him to be anywhere. For instance, he couldn't get off the ship when we went to England in 48 in Bombay because there were 10,000 people waiting to see him. We all snuck off, of course, and had a nice day, but he was a captive of his fame, really.
History records that Bradman led the 1948 side, the Invincibles, on their record-breaking undefeated tour of England. But Bradman's decision to make himself available for the tour only came after a degree of soul-searching.
It was absolutely vital after the desperate depression of the war years that England should have something to look forward to. And my father constantly wrote to Don to try to persuade him to change his mind, because he consistently said that he was never the player that he was before the war, and that he'd let everybody down, and that he didn't think his health was up to it, and he didn't want to leave the family. He had a range of excuses for not coming. But my father persevered and said, look, this will be the best tonic that this country's ever had, and perhaps put a little bit of pressure on him that England deserved a little bit of support in this area. And finally, in February 48, Don wrote and said to my father, well, you're right for the first time in your life. There is sentimentality in cricket, and it is only sentimentality that's going to take me back.
In the post-war period, 1948 particularly, he did embody the sort of coming together of the old empire, the new Commonwealth, the fact that we'd all fought the Germans and the Japanese together, bonding, and he was the embodiment of that. And that was the 48 side. This is why the 48 side were really very popular here, and Bradman in particular. And so the idea that he did, in some sense, change the relationship between Britain and Australia post-war, I think is true, and solidified, consolidated that relationship, which had been built up, obviously, during the war.
There was a great sense of gratitude about that 1948 team, the Invincibles. I mean, it was difficult to paint a picture of Britain at that time. It seemed to be ever shrouded in a kind of a smog. It was a dull, careworn place, and it lacked glamour. If you look at the audiences of the time, they wore flat caps and dark overcoats, even on hot days at Headingley. And the Aussies came over, and of course you had not just Bradman, but you had people like Miller, who were so glamorous. I mean, they looked like film stars, you know. They were different, they were bigger, they were browner, they had better teeth. They were just, you know, different people. They were like Hollywood film stars. And that team had a great aura around it that's not been with any team before or since, I fancy. It was perfect for the time. It was a perfect tonic for the British nation.
On the field of play, Bradman showed no mercy toward the opposition. Against Essex, Australia's mammoth score of 721 in a single day's play included a quick-fire 187 from Bradman.
Don came in just before lunch, and I think 20 runs were needed to get to 240 before lunch, which was two runs per minute. And the last over before lunch, we brought on our demon leg spinner, and Don looked at the first ball and played it. And then he hit the next four for four through mid-wicket, and our wicket-keeper, who was, in fact, quite a different young man who was playing his first match, said, "Excuse me, sir, have you got any other shots?" And Don said, "I'll show you a few after lunch." And the last ball of the over was bowled, which he again hit for four through mid-wicket, and then he turned around and he said, "I did say after lunch." And so it proved. He did.
The Headingley ground in Leeds was the scene of some of Bradman's great test innings. In 1930, he scored a then record 334. In 1934, he scored 304. And in 1938, he scored 103.
I first saw Don Bradman in 1948 at Headingley, and I shall always remember the anticipation there was around that match. So 40,000 people went to Headingley on each day of that test match, and they really went to see Bradman. I mean, it was almost like watching a kind of a great solo artist perform within the framework of a test match. And what I do remember more than anything else, I remember a little about his innings, was just the kind of noise the crowd made when he went out to bat, and the kind of anticipation of my father settling back for another feast of great batting. It didn't happen. He was bowled out by Dick Pollard, a yeoman bowler.
And Bradman, clean bowled by Pollard for 33.
But that's my only time that I actually saw Bradman play, and it's an everlasting memory, not so much of the man himself, but just of the occasion that surrounded him.
Bradman certainly made amends in the second innings when he combined with Arthur Morris in a partnership of 301, propelling Australia to a score of 3 for 404 in just 330 minutes, to give Australia a remarkable victory.
Originally we were thinking, save the game. The second session, have we got a chance? And the third session, we're going to get them, because we've got all the other players to come in, and we really, as they say in the old days, got stuck into himself. Brought about an extraordinary win, which nobody, I think, ever thought what could possibly happen.
To having to get the score for 404 inside the last day's play, to win a test match on the sixth day, as it was we didn't play Sundays in those days, so it was actually a 6-day wicket to win. And as Bradman's own words, it was Australia's greatest test victory.
Enter Don Bradman, who got a great ovation.
Statistics play a great part in the Bradman legend. Don Bradman needed to score just 4 runs in his final test innings at the Oval to finish with an average of exactly 100.
Well, it isn't often you get a big hand when you make a duck, but this was different.
That famous duck saw him finish with a celebrated test average of 99.94.
But I guess, you know, that the gods of cricket wouldn't allow anybody to end up with 100 average.
When he made that duck at the Oval in the last test in '48, Jim Swanton reckons that O'Reilly and Fingleton stood up and clapped and began to laugh hysterically. He thought they were going to have a stroke. And how they could generate such hatred towards their former teammate staggers me.
It still goes through all that period of playing on some real crook wickets and still averaging 99.4 is just out of this world. And of course nobody will ever come close to that, and this is the reason I think that people just revere him. They admire what he's done, and I think everybody in this country still knows that nobody's going to get near his figures.
I think it's close to impossible. 99.94 is a very, very special thing, and it's a God's gift. I mean, no one can go out, plan and achieve that average. It's a special thing to happen.
You can even get a baseball cap with 99.94 emblazoned across the top of it. That number's almost become its own myth. It circulates culturally. The ABC's postcode in all our national capitals. If you want to talk about whether the numbers speak more loudly than his acts, I'd probably point you towards those.
I think it's great that that no one has averaged 100 in Test cricket over a prolonged period of time. I think that really shows that the cricket, cricket is the boss. Whilst you're a player, there'll always be players, but cricket, the game, is bigger than the individual. I think that's significant that no one has reached that milestone. Sir Donald fell 4 runs short, but I think that's the way it was meant to be.
Bradman had a great understanding for how cricket history gets written. In terms of victories, in terms of numbers on paper. Statistics are central to the history of cricket and the stories we tell about it. Bradman takes this on, he embodies it. 99.94, undefeated on the Invincibles tour. It says a lot about the character of the man and his determination.
During their stay at Balmoral, Their Majesties invited the Australian cricketers, as well as the Scottish team they'd been playing, to tea at the castle. The Australians were presented. Here the Queen is talking to Miller. The Duke of Edinburgh was there and had a chat with Don Bradman. The cricketers walked with the royal family in the grounds during this very happy and privileged occasion at the conclusion of their brilliantly successful tour.
He was a great royalist. He spent at least 5 minutes when I was talking to him lauding the Queen Mother. Said what a marvellous woman she was. One of the highlights of his career, I've no doubt about it, was the visit to Balmoral in 1948.
Bradman was talking with the King. Unfortunately for him, he had his hands in his pockets, which the press quickly picked up on, and that was made a big deal of.
When he had his hands in his pocket, that was ridiculous. It was about 2 degrees below zero or something. And the only reason the King didn't have his hands in his pockets because he was wearing kilts. It was freezing. So,
when I asked him about the referendum, and he said that he thought a referendum would be lost, and rightly, he said, but he went on to say in 5 years' time it's possible the referendum would be won for a republic. So he was up to date to the point where he realised that the younger people were less royalist, if you like, less traditional than he was. But he was certainly a great royalist.
At the Aussies' farewell luncheon, held in the Savoy Hotel, London, a magnificent silver bowl was presented to Don Bradman by Lord Gowrie, MCC President, who handed it to him on behalf of subscribers from all over the country.
The Warwick vase is a magnificent item. It's solid sterling silver, handcrafted by a silversmith, and the money that was raised, I don't know the exact sum, but it must have been a fairly tidy sum. There was enough left over from the collection the newspaper took up that Sir Donald decided it should remain in England and be used to lay down cricket wickets in post-war, war-torn England.
Don Bradman returned home from the triumphant 1948 tour to his wife and children to prepare for his longest innings, life after cricket.
Sir Donald had a very tragic personal life. He and Jessie lost a son at not long after birth, when the first child. Then, of course, Shirley had cerebral palsy, and John, when he was 12, contracted polio, and it was quite a long battle with polio. And that must have just seemed so unfair to them.
An epidemic of poliomyelitis, or infantile paralysis as it used to be known, struck South Australia in the summer of 1951-52. The strain was particularly virulent, and young John Bradman was one of the many unlucky children to be affected.
After my mum died, he really needed a hand, and so I resigned from the university. I couldn't see that I could help him adequately and survive myself unless I did, so I resigned and gave him a hand. when I got polio, I needed a hand, and he resigned, and resigned from almost everything, and just stayed home to look after me. That was a very challenging time. I was in this thing they call a frame, and indeed it looks like a frame. It looks like a rack. It was very intimate because I was strapped in this thing 24 hours a day for a good part of a year, and so I needed very constant attention. We were talking earlier about off camera, and there are some obvious issues that need to be dealt with when you're strapped down 24 hours a day, and they had to help me, and he had to carry me to my bath, carry me to the dining room table where I did exercises.
Fortunately, John was one of the lucky ones who made a full recovery. In time, he developed into a fine athlete, and at one stage set a new South Australian record in the 120-yard hurdles.
The good thing for me, of course, was that having had polio, any achievement was a bonus. No, because nobody expected anything after I'd had polio. So it ended all the sports issues for me. So it's the best thing that could have happened.
Don Bradman, the private person, displayed a remarkable capacity for compassion in circumstances where people had suffered personal loss and grief.
It's a story about Colin Cowdrey. I was captain of Oxford the year after Colin, and when I was just taking over, Colin was put in the side to go to Australia on the Ashes tour, and his father died. Colin was deeply attached to his father. Now, when Don Bradman heard about this, he went out of his way not only to greet Colin Cowdrey when he arrived off the ship, but actually take him to his home, look after him, say, come on. Now, that's extraordinary, and Colin never forgot it. And he worshipped Don, thought it was marvellous. Now, that's what I call tenderness, which is quite surprising from someone like Don Bradman, who could be pretty fierce.
In 1979, I had a daughter killed in an air crash, and in 1982, my wife died after a very long illness. And he was very, very thoughtful and sympathetic about that, and began to talk about his own relationships and how he knew how people felt about it and so on and so forth. And from then on, this sort of openness continued.
I interviewed about 70 people over a period of 15 months for this book. When I started, I knew all about Sir Donald Bradman's statistics. I knew about the games he'd played. I knew very little about the man himself. And I was surprised. I found that he was a far more interesting man than I'd given him credit for. He was a far more intelligent man than I'd given him credit for. He brought to just about everything he touched that amazing sense of concentration that he showed in his cricket. So that applied to every facet of his life, his music, his golf, his billiards, I presume his reading, and certainly his writing of letters. I mean, really, he really was quite an amazing man. He had an extraordinary intellect.
When I started doing the talk show, I'd always had him top of my list to be interviewed. Because Bradman had a dimension to him that very few sportsmen have. I mean, he had a political dimension to him in the sense that he was much more important to Australia than just being a mere athlete. I mean, he was, and still remains, the icon of Australia. And in a younger country in those days, he was living proof that the Australians actually were a nation that could breed world beaters like this man.
He was always there, and he was always there in a sort of sober, responsible way. He never, there were never stories about him sort of, knocking over somebody at the casino or something like that. So that he was a sort of constant. And I think that that's enabled those people who saw him as a hero to he's just remained a hero.
You wouldn't believe it, he dropped me batting left-handed.
A lot of Aussie pride was invested in Don Bradman. So that's what fascinated me as much as the cricketer himself. This is a man who was such an important figure. And I wanted to find out what he was really like, because there was a lot of conflicting stories about Bradman, And so I set upon my futile search to interview Bradman. He and Sinatra were the two that got away.
He was a man who certainly had a high expectation of his own ability and what he could do. There is no doubt there was a confidence in himself that really took him through his life, and without that confidence he wouldn't have achieved anything like what he did. He had a self-belief. He had a strict regimen about how to proceed in things and a determination to finish the job.
When he decided on something, it was going to happen, or there had to be a good reason why not. And when he expressed an opinion, it was a brave man who would take issue with it. He was extraordinarily single-minded, extraordinarily.
Like in The Last Word was part of his makeup, and he liked to think he was right.
Don, I think, has to be accepted as a bit of a pedant, and an unrepentant pedant. He was always right, even when you could demonstrate he wasn't. And the pinnacle was when, allegedly, he even put Her Majesty the Queen right when she visited Adelaide. I think she was talking about the tide test of 60-61 in Brisbane. One of her advisors must have thought, well, that's good rich material, and she got a detail wrong, and he's said to have put Her Majesty right, and that probably was unique in the history of the monarchy.
I had a lovely story from Alex Bannister, who was a journalist who was with him when he covered the 53 and 56 tests. And he said how Sir Donald had been hired to write 1,000 words a day. And he picked him up one day at his flat in Whitehall, and Sir Donald was looking, cross and grumpy, and Alex said, "What's wrong?" Alex said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "They only printed 997.
Mind you, pedantry, of course, is a one-way street in a sense, but you can be pedant in order to ensure that things that are said about you or written about you are correct in your eyes. And Bradman was a great one for making sure that everything was written about him was right in his eyes rather than right in somebody else's eyes. And he could be very fierce with critics.
He is so determined that his view of history and his view of what took place during his career becomes the record that one almost feels that he's expunging other people who may have alternative views of cricket.
Now, most of my huge volume of mail contains requests for autographs, photos, help on school projects. There must be thousands of those going the rounds at the present time, and so on. But there's often a humorous twist, and some examples I thought might interest you. One said, "Dear Sir Donald, I'm 10 years of age and have admired you ever since I was young. I enjoyed that letter better than the next one, which said, I know this letter comes rather late, but I would always regret it if it came too late."
He was an assiduous letter writer and meticulous in replying to everyone who wrote to him, and for that he deserves great credit. There was also, I think, a degree of, certainly the letters that he wrote to my editor and one or two other people I know, of setting the record straight. And I think that would indicate the neat, orderly mind that he had, and the liking he had to actually control what that was known about him. He liked the story to be his version, if you like, rather than anybody else's, and I think that's what made him such an elusive interviewer. That was his privacy. That's what he guarded his reputation, how he guarded his reputation. So I think from that point of view, I mean, I think that the letters tell us an awful lot about the kind of man he was, or the letter writing.
I think it reflected his sense of inclusiveness, and that he wasn't a prejudiced person. He wanted to treat everybody exactly the same, and it was a case of whether it was a child or somebody of some station. It made no difference to him. He was very concerned to be respectful in the way he treated everybody, and that was a mode of communication which he really enjoyed.
Sir Donald gave his life to the game of cricket. We all talk about his career of 28-48. We all can cite off his test batting average and top scores and the like. But really, it was only the start of his giving to the game. He did much, much more as a cricket administrator. Without any doubt, he was one of the primary figures in shaping the game in the last 50 years of the 20th century.
He proved to be one of the best chairmen that the cricket board's ever had. It's like everything else he tried, I suppose. He succeeded at. But he was a great administrator. He put a hell of a lot back into the game, which he probably didn't really have to do, but he wanted to do it.
From the moment the Springboks ran from the players' race onto the playing arena, the anti-apartheid demonstrators sounded off with chants, firecrackers, abuse, foul language and shrill whistles that never let up for the next 100 minutes.
One of the most difficult decisions Sir Donald Bradman had to make as an administrator was to cancel the 1971-72 South African cricket tour of Australia. Anti-apartheid protests during the Springbok Rugby Tour of Australia during the winter of 1971 showed the level of disruption that could be generated by demonstrators.
The people were wheeling mailbags down the corridors of our offices from all over the place, and they were from archbishops and cardinals and from the general public and everything. And they're actually wheeling them down on trolleys, either in favour or against the South African tour.
I spoke to Meredith Bergman, who he actually wrote to out of the blue because she was opposing the South African tour in the early 70s, and he wanted to find out why. I mean, I found that really impressive, that he sought out people's opinions and didn't just wait for it all to be served up to him.
A decision had to be made for the good of many people and for the good of the game, and I know that was one of the hardest decisions he had to make, but he was determined to make it. But by the same token, he was always very careful that those decisions were made under the umbrella of cricket. It wasn't necessarily a political decision or a personal decision, it was made under the umbrella of cricket.
At Sir Donald Bradman's personal request, the great West Indian cricketer Gary Sobers agreed to captain a multiracial World 11 in a series of 5 international matches against Australia. Sobers repaid Bradman's faith in him by scoring a superb 254 in Melbourne, an innings Bradman later described as the finest innings he had seen played in Australia. That Sobers masterpiece ensured the ultimate success of the tour.
I arranged a dinner for the team, a final dinner, and I invited him as chairman of the board. And he came along. He was very thrilled to be there and be part of it. And I had said it wasn't to be a night of speeches, but he said, Bill has said it's not to be a night of speeches, but I want to make a speech. And he spoke, addressing each one around the table, talking about their performance on tour, how he appreciated their presence. And the interesting one came when he arrived at Richard Hutton, the son of Selene. And he said to Richard, he said, I understand, he said, I know that you've had a very ordinary tour. And he said, I know the difficulties of being the son of a famous person. He said, and I can tell you, and this is quite interesting, he said, I can tell you that within the space of the next few days, my son is going to change his name by deed poll. And that was, I'm pretty sure it's right, February 1972, about the 4th or 5th of February.
Yes, there were some pressures associated with it, and I needed to deal with them. And one of the options was to change my name, and that's eventually what I did. I talked to both my mum and my dad about it a great deal. I can remember several long chats sitting around the dining room table. They understood very well. I think my dad even understood better than my mum did. And in many ways, I think the change reflected their values. As a curious coincidence, the first person to suggest it as a possibility was him, before it had ever occurred to me.
He didn't agree with his son changing his name, and I couldn't understand the fact that he changed his name and made it so public, the fact that it was so close to his name it didn't matter. But he said to me that if that's what he wants to do, he has every right to do so, but he said, I am disappointed.
When I changed my name in the first instance, it was never to pretend I was somebody else. It wasn't to change my identity. I was quite happy for people to know who I was. I did it for certain reasons, and it was very effective. And my identity remained the same, and so I assumed that one day I would simply change it back again, which I did in consultation, particularly with my kids, because it had a big effect on them, and so they had to be part of that. And of course I discussed it with my dad, but he was quite matter of fact about it. He said, look, I don't mind. You can leave it as it is if you like, or change it back, that's okay. I'm happy with what you choose to do.
The significance of the Bradman name and its place in the social and cultural history of Australia is exemplified by the unprecedented intervention of the federal government of Australia to prevent the commercial exploitation of the Bradman name.
It is a special case, and I make no bones about that, and I believe on those grounds it's the right thing to have done.
The Prime Minister changed Australian corporations law by inserting the Bradman name alongside things like Anzac, University and Commonwealth. This is exceptional. The man was alive at the time. He is a private citizen, yet we have corporations law changed because he also happens to be a Brad name. This is an amazing precedent, and one that the Prime Minister was quite proud about. Perhaps he should be, perhaps he shouldn't be. That's up to people to think about. But it really is an exceptional act, and it says much about what he means and his significance.
The protection of the Bradman name is another aspect of the Bradman brand, that even the Prime Minister of Australia believes that the Bradman brand is significant for Australia, therefore has to be protected. And that's really quite an astonishing thing. I don't think it has ever occurred with any other sports person. I don't think it ever will. So in some ways, the Bradman brand is perhaps more unique in Australian sport than any other brand, and it's up there with the baggy green cap.
The market for Bradman memorabilia has seen phenomenal prices paid for items, Bradman's test caps being of particular importance. He gave his most famous test cap, the one worn on the 1948 Invincibles tour, to his godson, Richard Robbins.
My father had been given, during his test playing days, a South African cap on a swap. And I'd found in the Australian official brochure for 1956 the badge. And so I cut round the badge and stuck it on the front of the South African cap and wedged it on, and was using that to represent my Australian heroes, when Don arrived, and he said, "Oh, you can't do that. I'll have to send you one of my own." And I can still remember him making a note in the diary saying, and on my 11th birthday, his last test cap arrived.
Bradman's first test cap from 1928-29 is on permanent display at the Bradman Collection in Adelaide, and was given to family friend Peter Dunham.
I walked up the stairs, and at the end of the stairs you walk straight across, you come to the den, quite a small den, and Sir Donald was in there, and he said, "Sit down." I sat down, and he said, "Now watch this." And he had this contraption that he was winding very slowly, and it was showing frame by frame Ian Meckiff, if you recall, I'm sure you do recall the situation. Ian Meckiff, frame by frame bowling, and Sir Donald would say to me, "See his elbow now, see it now, see it now, see it now." And this was at the time of the Ian Meckiff controversy, was he a thrower, was he a chucker or not? But while I was looking at the frames, this something was put on my head. And my memory is, and this is 45 years ago, but my memory is that he turned me slightly and I looked in a mirror above the little gas fireplace they had, and there was this green, what turned out to be a baggy green cap on my head. And I have memories of saying something to the effect of, "That looks good," and he replied, "That looks very good, it's yours." And that's how I got the cap.
Sir Donald Bradman's legacy to the game of cricket will live on through the work of the Bradman Foundation and the Bradman Museum in Bowral, his boyhood home. The museum stands adjacent to the ground where the young Don played his first cricket matches. It is now known as Bradman Oval.
He just seemed to transcend national boundaries in I suppose, a common appreciation of that achievement and what he came to represent. And to an extent, the Bradman Museum here in Bowral has become a showpiece or a showcase of Bradman's life, not just a celebration of Australian cricket, but a celebration of the game at a world level. And we're finding that certainly Bowral itself has taken on a pilgrimage status, such as a Mecca is to other people, and so on. It really is a special place, I think, in the world of cricket, and we're finding a lot of international visitors are coming here because this is the closest they will get to a Don Bradman, and the closest they will come to trying to find out what made this man tick.
After all is said and done, Sir Donald Bradman was an ordinary human being whose extraordinary talent touched the lives of many admirers all around the world. The name Bradman has come to represent many things to many people: as a cricketer, as a man, as a hero, as a symbol, as an icon, and as a legend.
I haven't seen anyone that I would say would be close to him. He would hit the ball with plenty of power, wonderful timing, and it just never looked like getting out. I mean, he looked as though he could go on and on and on, hitting fours to all parts of the ground.
To see the way his foot was so close to the ball when it was made contact with the bat, the precision that the bat came through at a perfectly vertical position, because he wasn't a brutal hitter of the ball. It was all in timing, and to see him just time the ball and the ball streak to the boundary.
I was really impressed by the way he managed to live a remarkably normal life and yet be Don Bradman, which was a remarkably unnormal thing to be. I think that was part of his cleverness, really, that he kept a life for himself in spite of everybody wanting a piece of him.
I think that he added to what may be innately Australian, which is a sense of competitiveness, individualist competitiveness, and that is, I think, still a good Australian characteristic. So I think to that extent, and to the extent that he succeeded in what he was doing, did shape Australian culture.
In terms of where Bradman fits with the embodiment of the Australian nation, is he embodies a valuable part of its history. He can't represent all of Australia. He can't be the Australian hero. He can be an Australian hero. There are so many different parts of this country. Australia is diverse in many, culturally, in communities, in terms of attitudes, in terms of cities, in terms of regions. Bradman can't stand in for all those. It's far too heavy a burden for any one man to bear. And it's not fair on him.
It's a very interesting question as to whether the Bradman legend appeals to people from non-British backgrounds. And I think it does, in the same way that the Gallipoli legend has become very inclusive. His narrative transcends the original ethnic character of cricket. Cricket still doesn't have many star players from multicultural backgrounds. It's quite different from Australian football and rugby league, and to a less extent rugby union. But it's ironic that I think one would find that the Bradman legend encompasses a wider ethnicity. It's become part of the Australian legend.
W.G. Grace had his day. He's still spoken of nearly 100 years after his death. Englishmen speak of Jack Hobbs, but beyond that, not many cricketers go on being the centre of conversation, let alone the subject, so long after they laid the bat down for the last time. And it's because this man was more than a cricketer. He was a symbol. He was a very, very important symbol of what Australia stood for.
Every time we went out to bat, he had the nation's weight upon his shoulders, and as a young kid you dreamed of playing cricket, and for me I guess I dreamed of being hopefully some part as good as Sir Donald Bradman when I went out to bat. So He was what the Australian cricket was all about, the essence of Australian cricket, what it means to be an Australian cricketer, and he had all the dreams and hopes of young people.
I used to get so near to him and then he'd disappear. And I once held a warm cup of tea that he'd left, and I thought, it's like a treasure, it's a footprint in the sand. He was absurd. He was a grown man trying to get near to this iconic figure. The nearest I ever got to him was 15 places away. I counted them at Adelaide.
And then I'm sure we have a budding journalist in the lad who wrote, "I am Ian Smith and I'm 12 years old. A lot of the cricketers who play first-class cricket today are undisciplined and get paid too much. Don't you agree?" I can imagine the press headlines if I said yes to that one. And my last example is from a boy who I think is Prime Minister material. After writing a confident and positive letter about himself and his ambitions, he finishes up, "P.S. Keep this signature, it will be valuable someday."